Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our first webinar of our summer series entitled I.T.E.A.C.H, where we are talking about education, assessment, and current happenings in today's education market. My name is Allison Boyven, and I am on the marketing team here at Riverside Insights. I am joined today by Vicki Thomas, who is the head of product for our achievement assessments. And we are both former classroom teachers, and we will be your hosts today for today's webinar. We will be tag teaming with some questions throughout the session. We are thrilled today to have our two esteemed experts join us to share about the impact of COVID recovery efforts on student progress in math from the national and state levels. And then at the local level, they're going to discuss assessment reports and skill level data and rigor within specific math items that can directly impact classroom instructional practices and efficiently grow student learning. We will also identify some practical strategies that you can implement this upcoming school year. But before we get started and introduce today's speakers, we need to share a few announcements. Each week this summer, we will be presenting webinars on various topics within education. District and building level educators will be sharing their thoughts as well on some of the topics that you can see here, like PLCs and data meetings, balanced assessment plans, and how assessment data guides instruction. So be sure to join us next Tuesday at the same time as we dig into assessment scores, and look for that webinar invite this week. During today's session, you may have questions that you would like answered from our speakers, and we certainly welcome those questions. So please type those into the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen, and it may look something like this image shown here on the left. We will be sure to share your questions as the topic arises throughout the conversation. There are also a few handouts included with today's session. Those are located under the handouts area of the right side of the panel, so be sure to download those today during the webinar. Also, today's session is being recorded, and you will receive the recording, a copy of the slides, the handouts, and a certificate of attendance in the next day or two. So be on the lookout for that in your inbox. All recordings of our previous webinars can be found on our website at info.riversideinsights.com/K12PD. So opening this page provides you with this header shown here. We're very excited to have with us our two authors of the Iowa assessments, Dr. Kathy Welch and Dr. Steve Dunbar. And I will pass it over to them to introduce themselves before we get going.
Thank you very much, Allison. I'm Kathy Welch. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about measurement and getting good information out of the assessments that we give.
And I'm Steve Dunbar, also at the University of Iowa. Kathy and I are co-directors of a unit there called Iowa Testing Programs, and it's a research and development unit that we use as a platform for statewide testing, as well as the development of new assessments.
Well, we are very glad to have both of you here with us. It's definitely a privilege to have you both talking about your research insights and discussing practical applications in the classroom, really to help students at the classroom level. I know we have district and building administrators and teachers joining us today. We know that COVID has had an incredibly negative effect on math learning loss, so we are looking forward to hearing about the efforts to mitigate the learning loss and how those efforts are working, and also what areas of math students are showing signs of recovery and where we might really need to focus on instructional practices in the classroom. And then thinking about the rigor of assessment items and instruction. How does that rigor affect what and how we teach math, and how we take those answers and apply them in the classroom? So there's a lot to talk about today, I know. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to both of you to share your insights.
Thanks very much, Allison. Again, thank you for the opportunity to talk today about math and moving forward, really. We have a couple primary learning objectives for today. First, to help use good assessment information to make instructional decisions that can move our students forward. And then to help educators better understand sort of which skills are struggling, which skills seem to be maintaining, which skills need additional time. So thank you, Allison. You could move that forward. Those are our primary learning objectives today, and we'll set that within a couple different contexts. One is really our philosophy around assessment at the university. We really think of assessment as information, the translation of good information for the student and that student's family, as well as the educator. That and the quality and the value of the information should really be the driver. We have the privilege of working on the research side of things to make that information as accessible, as fair, as valid, as reliable as possible, but it's really always within knowing the audience is really the student and the educator that's there to help the student. So I just wanted to share that because oftentimes we hear a lot about measurement and sophisticated models and sophisticated ways to understand data, and we're trying to make it as transparent and as accessible as possible while you sort of have some faith in the back end of things are being handled by the researchers, but it's really the forward-facing information that is so critical to this. So the next slide is really, we're going to talk a lot about comparisons today. And we know in the post-COVID era, the value of comparisons is really, really of great importance to everybody. And that's the comparison of where that child was today versus where they were 2 years ago, where that child is compared to his or her classroom, where they are compared to the building they are housed within, how they do on test items in particular compared to other students, how they do compared to the nation as a whole. The value of comparisons is really even more critical today. And the next slide helps us really think about, because a lot of things like mastery levels, being sure we have criterion reference interpretations, state standards, and so forth, those have all sort of taken a toll throughout COVID. A lot of those are more difficult to understand and interpret in today's world. So as we go forward in this new world post-COVID, again, the comparisons, I think, help the instructor better understand where they need to go, what they need to address, what's really high on the list of priorities, what might be more in the middle of the list of priorities, because understanding sort of where students are, students with similar demographics, students that came through COVID at different points in their sort of educational experience, those are all extremely important comparisons. So this will be a recurring sort of theme today. How is this comparison helpful to you as an educator in moving forward? Thank you, Allison. The next few slides really just quickly summarize what we know since COVID and what we're seeing as we're moving forward. I think everyone was very aware that the 2021-22 year was a little bit more normal for students, and we're still waiting for the spring 23 data to be analyzed by individual states. But we know also that students have not necessarily returned, especially in the area of mathematics. I think we've seen a greater return to normal in reading, but mathematics continues to lag behind the reading subject. So again, the focus today is to really, what can we do to move forward from this point, from the spring of 2023 and going into this academic year of 23-24. Thank you, Allison. The next one really shows, again, what we've seen that supports these sort of broad sweeping statements about math is struggling. We know in NAEP, for instance, their reported declines in grade 4 and grade 8 mathematics were significant on their scales, really showed decreases across all demographic areas, really, for those the scores that were captured in the spring of 2022. Now we won't have these data points again for a little while, but understanding that downward curve in grades 4 and 8, again, part of this national conversation that's saying mathematics is really sort of needs additional time to recover.
Part of the challenge at the local level, as you can see, because NAEP results in this national perspective only happens about every 2 years. I mean, there's in fact a 1-year delay in NAEP because of the pandemic. How to understand at a local level whether or not your results are mirroring things that are seen nationally, or with more recent data that you're collecting at the local level, you see signs of improvement that we won't see at this national perspective for another 2 years. I think that's something very important for you to think about as you look at your own district level assessment data.
And the next slide sort of summarized the NAEP, sort of the big takeaways. We knew all students in mathematics really lost ground, but disproportionately the students that were in the lower percentile or performance quartiles were those that struggled even more. NAEP quantified those in terms of weeks of instruction. Other testing agencies, other policies, other centers have done similar things, trying to translate the loss into effect on instruction. We also have seen that the results vary dramatically by state, and which states had different sort of return to school, return to learn policies in place. And those, I think, will play out as states move forward and try to better analyze their own data. But what we do know, the major takeaways here nationally, is that there was a huge lag in performance. It's going to take a while to get back to where we were in 2019.
We'd like to think that good use of assessment data will step up the recovery. That is, the learning recovery can benefit a great deal from careful analysis and use of your own local assessment data.
The next slide summarizes a couple takeaways that we, within our state, within the districts we've worked with, within the dioceses we work with, so in mathematics in particular, we have seen that the higher performing students are tending to recover more quickly, that they are sort of, their trajectories seem more stable and even upward moving in 2022. Again, consistent with NAEP, the lower performing students in districts in particular states have lost additional ground, and at best have sort of maintained at a lower level. We've also seen significant differences in the domains within mathematics. Some domains have remained pretty stable, others have dropped dramatically, and the same as you might expect with the cognitive levels. The easier items, the lower, the items that are lower on the cognitive scales tend to have maintained as well, but the extended reasoning, the depth of knowledge 3 items, that's sort of those that require perhaps multiple processes, those too have struggled. So those are some major takeaways from the state and districts that we work closely with. The next one just sort of shows these in a graphic form. You can see that here we have 5 different sort of levels of performance in the state of Iowa. Again, but you can see those students at the lowest level, the ones represented by the purple line at the bottom, those students really changed and then have just sort of stayed at the lowest levels of performance. Where the top, the students represented by the blue lines, they showed some growth immediately and have maintained that growth as well. Even those in the green line, sorry, more around the 75th percentile, have showed that upper trajectory, upper movement after the first year or two.
And keep in mind that this is just one example from grade 3 mathematics. Some of the increases that you see even in 2021 at the higher performing levels did not occur at grades where the mathematical content is more complex. In those are some examples of areas where we've seen trends that have still not recovered even after a second assessment year post-pandemic. Kathy mentioned something about the cognitive level. Next slide. And with respect to how we classify items in terms of whether you use the term depth of knowledge or what we are calling here essential concepts, conceptual understanding, and extended reasoning, you can see the more complex the cognitive level of the questions, the more difficult they became after the pandemic. So what we're noticing is that relatively routine aspects of the mathematics curriculum, next slide, for example, that might be represented by DOK level 1 or what might call essential competencies. Those are in the green triangles there, and the diagonal line represents consistent or same level of performance in 2019 and 2021. Anything above the diagonal line, we're seeing actually improvements. Anything below the diagonal line, we're seeing that in 2021, there was a significant drop in the relative difficulty of questions in this example from grade 5 mathematics. And so the level 2 and the level 3 cognitive levels, conceptual understanding and extended reasoning, are definitely ones that we're looking at carefully as we try to assess the extent to which instruction is creating a learning recovery from the pandemic. Next slide is actually just a little bit more detail about this same idea. And I don't think we need to say a whole lot more about that, but clearly the trend related to cognitive level is an important aspect of getting deeper in understanding what the pandemic effects on mathematics instruction were. In the next slide, we see a similar plot where we tried to identify the domains of the mathematics curriculum that might have been affected negatively by the pandemic. Our domains are operations and algebraic thinking, number sense and functions, numbers in base 10, measurement and data, and geometry across the bottom in those abbreviations. I think the one thing I wanted to point out here for grade 5 mathematics is we all know the importance of the introduction of fractions into the mathematics curriculum that occurs grade 4, grade 5, depending on scope and sequence. But what we're seeing here is that the pandemic had a very dramatic effect on those items, in particular the gray diamonds, but others as well were affected negatively. So we're seeing these effects by domain, by cognitive level, and in thinking about how you're going to look at your own assessment data and understand more deeply how to utilize those data to improve instruction, it's very important for you to get beyond the total score and to try to break out your students' performance in terms of cognitive levels of items, as well as in terms of the mathematics domains that they represent.
So the next slide sort of says, okay, where do we go? So that was sort of our brief history of where we've been the last couple of years, but we do want to focus most of today's presentation on, okay, what can we do? What do we have in front of us that we can take advantage of and better understand and affect my instruction? So the next slide just sort of shows where we are in this. You all have standards, whether they be in your district, whether they be state, whether they be mandated by your diocese. Your standards are your guide for how you plan and implement your instruction locally. Where we're suggesting is after that delivery of instruction, whether it be within or at the end of the year or at the beginning of the year, but you stop and assess, and that you spend significant time then evaluating those results and using all of your other information, all of your collateral information you have based on classroom instruction, other collateral assessments, statewide assessments, that you use these in concert with one another to adjust instruction so that the plan repeats itself moving forward. And I think unlike pre-COVID, I think helping to really identify where these areas are that need additional instruction particularly in mathematics, where there is more of a building block. And again, depending on your state standards or your district standards, those things have been put together very precisely under the assumption that we need foundational skills first. We need, before we move on, we need to have mastered certain skills. So understanding that hierarchy, I think, in mathematics is even more critical than understanding a similar hierarchy in reading, where a lot of the standards remain the same. It's just the reading, the complexity of the text is changing. That's a little different in mathematics. So we're going to walk through several examples today, and the next slide will sort of set up the two examples we're going to use today in particular.
So with respect to the Iowa assessments, one of the documents that you see in your list of handouts is we call the Content Classifications Guide. This is a very detailed description of each test question in each level of the Iowa assessment. So if you went to grade 3 and found the mathematics assessment, which would be for level 9, you would see the number, you would see the information in the column labeled grade 3 here. And this is just a basic breakdown of domains that are represented in the assessment. And you can use this guide to understand item by item what the questions in the grade 3 mathematics tests are assessing in terms of the mathematics domains that are indicated here in the first column. And likewise for the grade 5 level 11 Iowa assessment mathematics test.
And it's this sort of information that actually, especially that standard/skills assessed area, that's the sort of the category what's going to help you affect your instruction more than anything else. And understanding what those skills are. And again, looking at performance at that skill level, and again, sort of give you a roadmap to moving forward. We know a lot of tests sort of help to sort of maybe give different tests to different students. What this is allowing us to do is every student in 5th grade or every student in 3rd grade is taking the same set of 50 items or 60 items. And therefore that allows you to directly look at impact of instruction as seen through these 50 or 60 items and how your students are doing on those items. And so it allows that more direct connection to your own instruction.
So this content classification guide is sort of a basic resource. It is a very detailed document. What we're going to go through in the next several slides are some reports that utilize information that's contained in this content classification guides to look at performance from several points of view. So Kathy, if you want to
go to the next slide actually sort of gives us the 3 we're going to walk through: a performance profile, an item analysis, and an item response record. And I think the big takeaways here, we've got a class level for both the performance profile and the item analysis. But then in the item response record, you're able to go into the individual and understand how many of your own students in your class answered this item correctly. And when they didn't answer that item correctly, which distractor, which alternative choice did they select? So we go class, and individual. We also have, again, going back to that theme of comparisons, these reports allow us to make some very direct comparisons. We can compare within your class, we can compare to the nation, we can compare to the building, we can make comparisons over time. If you have students within your building that are taking it in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, you can monitor those students across time. So comparisons become, again, sort of as we're trying to move every student along the learning continuum, that comparison to themselves or to others is a very critical part of that next steps. Okay, so the next report is this class performance profile. And there's a couple things. There's this slide that gives us the elements of the class performance profile. And there's a lot of information on this that we're going to dig into here in a moment or two. But I think just taking a minute to look at the profile itself, the scores obviously in this case are a combination, not just mathematics, but everything a class may have participated in. And different types of scores, standard scores, national percentiles, by both the test level and the skill level are presented on this type of report. The lower half of this report has a different metric, a percent correct metric, that allows you again to look at, for instance, the 15 items in number sense and how many of your students answered those 15 items correct and so forth. So again, definitely information that directly connects to your instruction. So we're using this information to make some sort of leads in the next few slides to help us say, what do I do with this next? The next slide that Allison will show is that resource that is also posted to the Go To webinar here. So we'll just go through this, but this is one of those 5 different resources that are available to you. So you can better understand the metrics that are a part of this and really understand sort of how they interact with one another. But what we'd like to do is really starts on the next slide and how we can look at this information. So I pulled out just the mathematics. In this example, there were 5 different domains in mathematics. As Steve said a moment ago, those are listed there in the left-hand corner. And the number of items, these are all from that lower half of the performance profile, the number of items for this grade level that are represented in each of those 5 different domains. And then the percent correct that the class was able to answer correctly. So of those 15 items in number, sense, and operations, the class as a whole answered 50% of those correctly. And I can compare that to nationally, this class did or performed very, very similarly to the national percent correct, okay? And so what you get on that lower half of that report are also where there is a significant difference between the percent in the class versus the percent nationally. And what I've highlighted here is in one particular domain, data analysis and probability and statistics, there was a significant difference on those 7 items, meaning this particular class way underperformed relative to the national. So 15% difference in those 2 when I make that comparison. The others are very similar to one another. Actually, in measurement, the class is outperforming the nation by a difference of 8. So that might not be an area you're worried about. The others are very, very close to the national. But where you might dig deeper is in that data analysis and probability statistics domain.
And this is where your understanding of the link between your own instructional practices and the questions included in the Iowa assessments is critically important. We couldn't begin to explain in this class why there's that 15 percentage point difference for that middle category, but understanding what's happening at the local level in terms of scope and sequence is the factor that will help you explain how to understand that 15-point difference and to evaluate whether that's a difference that's important to you and that you want to affect by changes to instruction.
Now listen, the next slide shows just a different example. Again, sort of the same categories, but here we have those 15 items in number, sense, and operations where there was a significant difference. So again, knowing I had 15 items here and a difference of -12 between the 32 and the 44 nationally, that may even suggest there's a greater need in that I had 15 items and I perhaps have a more stable sort of take on number, sense, and operations as represented by 15 items. So the next slide helps me dig a little deeper within that number, sense, and operations. Going back to that content classifications guide that Steve referenced, I know that within the domain of number, sense, and operations, there are a series of sub-skills and standards that are represented there. So those 15 items really break out into, hey, there are 4 items that get at represent, compare, and order numbers. there are 3 items that get at perform operations and so forth. And you can go through each of those and say, okay, now I can better understand what number, sense, and operations means. And I can think about my own standards and think, how does, when the Iowa assessments say, represent, compare, and order numbers, what does that mean to me? Well, those 4 items in the state of Iowa, and the state of Iowa has actually built our standards based on the core standards. I can look in our standards in our state and say, oh, these match up to number in base 10, A3, B3, and so forth. And I can do that direct comparison between performance on these 15 items and what my state is doing. So as Steve referenced, what's here on the right-hand side of the screen is specific to the state of Iowa. But as you have these conversations locally, thinking about where is represent, compare, and order numbers, where are you teaching it? Is it in 5th grade? Perhaps it's in 4th grade in your state, in which case you might have a better understanding of why you're seeing what you are seeing, or perhaps it's in 6th grade, or maybe you tested in the fall of 5th grade and you cover that in the spring of 5th grade. So only you know the answer to those questions, but there will be logical explanations for why, for instance, on the slide before, we saw that difference of -12 in number, sense, and operations. Okay, thank you, Allison. The next one takes us into the item analysis report.
Right, and this first slide is just an overview of the contents of the report. This is where we get into a little finer grain level of detail about performance on a mathematics assessment. The previous performance profile was a broader look at domains across all the tests in the Iowa assessments, and we illustrated details about the mathematics test in order to help you understand how best to use that report. Here we're assuming now we continue to be interested in mathematics, and we want to get down to a finer level of detail in looking at a classroom's performance on the mathematics test item by item. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the detail that's provided in one of the resources for this webinar. That is the report guide for the class item analysis. It's, I guess, the 3rd one in the list over there in the box on the right of your screen. And this is simply a really nicely designed blow up of a portion of the class item analysis report. For the Iowa assessments, you would see one of these item analysis reports for the reading test, for the written expression test, for the science test, whatever tests you gave in your district, you would have the capability of looking at an item analysis report like this at the classroom level or at any other group level as well. If you go to the next slide, we've zoomed in on one area where we had identified data analysis, probability, and statistics, where there was a 15-point difference between the average percent correct in this district or in this classroom and the average percent correct in the nation. And we'd like to know, okay, at the item level, can we better understand where that difference is taking place? And so the next slide, Allison, has a circle around the 4 items. The numbers are small, but you can see 38 through 40 and then 46, where the difference between performance on these individual items in the classroom and performance in the nation was quite large. A 40-point difference for that first item circled number 38, and other differences of 17, 41, and 20 if you really want to get into the details. Again, this is drilling down from the overall mathematics score to the domain of data analysis and probability, and now to the questions in that domain where we noticed the largest difference. So the next slide identifies the sub-skills and standards that those items relate to. And it turns out that a whole bunch of them, 5 of them, have to do with concepts in statistics related to central tendency, variability, and interpreting data to make predictions. So that's just one more level of detail in terms of sub-skills. And to illustrate an example, we're going to go to the next slide and show you the page of the test booklet where those questions, where there were dramatic differences between the classroom's performance and the nation, were observed. And here you can examine these questions in detail to understand what's being asked and how that might relate to how this content might have been taught in your classroom. The first two, 39, 38, and 39 just deal with interpreting graphical information in the stimulus at the top of the page. The item 40 is a question about central tendency, which answer was the most frequent or the mode of this distribution of scores. So that sort of sequence of steps where you're going from a performance profile to identify a category, to an item analysis, to find that category, to the items themselves, illustrates a way in which you can use the reports available to you from the Iowa assessments to drill down into a point where you can understand how best to perhaps influence your instruction.
So the third and the last report we want to highlight is on the next slide. Thanks. A class item response record. And again, as Steve said, one we just like that, the item analysis, really give you that class level result. This one helps me go even deeper into how my individual students were doing. So again, the slide you're looking at here is just an overall of what the scores and the metrics that are reported here. There's a lot of information contained in this type of report, but I think that the critical takeaways, again, are thinking about those metrics of percent correct, both within the class or the building, as compared to the percent correct within the nation. And then across the top of this report are those skills. So understanding at that level what those items are actually measuring. The next, again, following the same structure here, the next slide shows in the reference to the GoToWebinar handout here that will help explain those metrics. I know you hate to have all this information, but these you can go back to and refer to when you have more time and think about what those metrics mean. So those handouts are great references. And then next few slides just help us walk through a similar example to what Steve just took us through. So again, we're in mathematics here. We're in a grade 5 class item response record. We're highlighting a couple different items here. This item in particular, we're looking at item 55, which is really a very, very difficult item. For the class and the building, very difficult. 10% of these students answered this item correct. But when you look at the nation, you can see it was a difficult item for the nation as well. And so as 27% of the students in the nation. So we know that's a difficult item. What this slide also shows us is that for every student in this class that answered that item incorrectly, you know which of the alternative answers they chose. So they took A's and D's and C's, where the keyed response to this item is B. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see how I can use this information. Okay, here's the item itself. When you divide a number by 10,000, you move the decimal to the left. How many places? Okay, so in the state of Iowa, that aligns with our place value system and number and operations in base 10 at grade 5. Again, the place to start there is where is this being covered? Where is the place value concepts being covered within your curriculum? In the Iowa assessments, we put that into performs operations as a skill. So we know where that belongs and how it then sort of what is the overall domain, but it goes up to an overall domain within that area. Okay, and we can look and see that many of those students selected A as that correct response. So A meaning they chose number 3, or they chose the answer 3. So when you divided a number by 10,000, many of those students thought that answer should be 3 rather than the correct answer of 4. So again, that helps you as an instructor say, oh, they're miscounting here. Oh, they're not just randomly, most of them were going for A. There were a few people going for C, but most of them that chose the incorrect response were sort of counting or assuming the wrong starting place or something. But again, knowing that, taking that back to your instructional standards and where you address place value is what you would do with that information. We're not suggesting you teach this particular item. We're suggesting that this is a flag for your instruction, that a lot of students in this particular class somehow had a misconception about how to do this. Or again, perhaps, as I've said before, maybe this has not been covered in your instruction when this test was given. And that's a perfectly valid thing to say. Say, when we get there, we need to emphasize place value. The next slide, Allison, is just another example, similar way. We have an item that is 40% of the students in this class and building, are the same here, answered the item correctly, and 45% of the students in the nation answered this item correctly. You can see going down that list, again here, many students chose C as that alternative, even though there were a few A's and D's sprinkled in there. But I would say the majority of students that missed this item chose C. So the next slide, again, looking at this particular item, we know, again, this is an item that asks students to solve equations and inequalities. We would, again, within our state, have this mapped to a particular standard within our state. And we can look at the item itself, and again, knowing that the key or the alternative response that many students went towards was C. You can go backwards and figure out why did they get to 20? Was it that they assumed the first half and the second half was balanced with respect to second quarter, fourth quarter, or what was it in their sort of misstep where they led them to choose C and 20 versus the response, the correct response? So again, not teaching to the item, but understanding where students may have made missteps in their thinking about these equations and solving for the inequalities here. Okay, thank you, Allison. The next is a quick little overview of a multi-measure student report.
And we just simply presented this as an example where you could utilize the capabilities of the data manager system in order to put results of two similar assessments that are in your database together and look at relative performance of individuals. So in this report, you'd have a list of student names on the left-hand side, and you would have the capability to indicate for each of these tests, the mathematics test and the computation test, what levels of performance were levels of concern for you. In this particular case, we have the levels of performance divided into quite a few categories. But if you were, for example, looking at mastery, you might have a criterion for mastery of 80% for an item, in which case you would have two colors represented in the two columns. And you would be able to see very quickly, based on your definition of mastery, which students were mastering skills in mathematics or in computation. And this would be an example of a case where you were wanting to use two assessments in order to understand or identify students that you thought needed some kind of intervention, or students who might be ready for some kind of enrichment in your classroom or school. But we like this multi-measure report and just wanted to call it out as so that you could spend a little time on it on your own or with your Riverside rep to understand best how to utilize it.
The next slide just transitions us into, we've talked a lot about okay, as we look at an individual sort of class, how they perform, or an individual student, how that student performed, we also know there's great value in looking across time. And I think, again, as we come out of the pandemic, thinking about time and thinking this is a recovery period, time is really what we're interested in as one more variable in this equation. So the next couple slides just show a couple really quick things that we can do in comparisons at the domain level, but across years. So I could take, for instance, my fifth graders who were fifth graders in 2022, my fifth graders who were fifth graders in 2023, and look at their percent correct by domain. And that's what I've done here, just real simply looking at that domain level again, because the domain level is sort of my first entry point into instruction, thinking about, okay, they did do better. My last year's this year's fifth graders did do better in number sense than my previous. However, they didn't do as well in data analysis and understanding this. I've also mapped here the national sort of going as a point of reference again for that comparison. The national is that line going across the top. And you can see, again, in fifth grade, nationally, geometry is a little bit more difficult, not only in this class for 2 years or 2 fifth grade classes across time, but nationally as well. So, and data analysis being a little easier for the nation. So that's another point of comparison that is a very legitimate thing to do, especially if you are a teacher that remains in a given grade. Your students move on, but you're very interested in watching cohort over cohort within your classroom. The next just presents information, again, thinking about item comparisons across years.
And if you go quickly to the next slide, Allison, if you were, for example, identified the area of data analysis and probability, and particularly that cluster of questions related to the interpretation of graphical information, and viewed that as a concern in a given year of 2022, for example, you could go right back into Data Manager and find out for your 2023 results whether a change in instruction had an impact on those items. This is an example of a very tangible use of information at the item level that we think is a very responsible use, and a use that allows you to reinforce the link between your instructional practices and scope and sequence in your curricula and the assessment that you're using to help understand how students are moving through that curriculum. And don't just take the example that I illustrated, but examine your own data and see if there are clusters of items or skills that illustrate similar patterns. You should also be looking for clusters of items where the performance of your classroom or your school is markedly higher than what you're seeing in the nation, and take note of those cases as well, because I think teachers always need to understand what their success areas are, as well as the areas where you think there might be a need for more focused instruction.
So the next slide just sort of summarizes what we're hoping are takeaways today. So we think of the use of information from assessments as a perfect opportunity for professional conversations. It is time consuming. It is, but I believe you'll find the time spent really time well spent overall, that it helps you really think about the value. You've already given up instructional time to give the assessments. Your students have given up instructional time to take the assessments. So why not get as much information out of it as possible to help fill in and help you move forward? And so those conversations are extremely, extremely valuable, even in understanding how an assessment calls something one thing, how you may have a different translation of that in your classroom, but understanding that. I would bet every item on these tests will find a home in your instruction. It might not be labeled identically what you're calling it in your classroom, but they are skills that over the years have been there and appropriately placed at given grade levels, again, because they're building standards across time. So that comparison to your own standards, to your enacted curriculum, is really, really important. And then we always believe in collateral information. The more information you have about a student, the better. And I know you as classroom educators, of course, have your greatest confidence in your own assessment. You deal with the student every day of the year. So we look at assessments like the Iowa assessments as a piece of information that can be used in a complementary way. It's a piece of information that should, we hope, confirm your beliefs about the student, but also give you more detailed information to go sort of a little deeper in with respect to your class. And the last slide is just really, again, going back to when we started, we had a little circle about the alignment of standards and instruction and assessment. We know that this is an ongoing process, that you instruct, and then you stop and assess. And then that evaluation of those assessment results really helps you to differentiate the next step. But then we repeat this over and over and over every year, and every year is a different cohort, or you may be shifting things within your own districts and dioceses based on what these assessment results might be telling you. Might be saying in 5th grade, they really aren't understanding fractions very well. Let us go back. Let us think this cohort of students that came through the pandemic in a certain year, now all of a sudden they're 7th graders and they're still struggling with fractions. Well, it's never too late to stop and help those students relearn those skills that are so important to subsequent mastery in these areas. So those were our prepared comments. I will turn this back to Allison and see if there are questions that might have come from.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathy and Steve, for all your wonderful insights today. I think just the value from what I got from it was really the fixed form piece. With the Iowa assessments, you can start at that really high level and then drill all the way down into the items and do a distractor analysis and really see where are your students not doing as well and why would they have picked A, B, C, or D, and start to group students instructionally who missed maybe that same question and answered it in the same way and things of that nature, and looking at the rigor of the items for vocabulary and looking at you know, where the groupings can occur and how students are doing, and all of those reports. Handouts, looks like some of you may have missed where the handouts are. Those are located on the right side of the panel of your screen that shows handouts, and that's a little arrow maybe to where those are. So see a question. Best practices to have teachers review the question they have notated, and how would you be able to do that? Yes, in terms of a fixed form, how would, Kathy and Steve, can you share with us a little bit about that? If they were to use like the class item response record, for example, that report, how could they think about looking at specific items?
One way we have done that with users in the state of Iowa is simply to direct them to the test booklets. If they happen to be paper testers, they'll have test booklets available, and the district or building coordinators can manage we've done workshops where teachers are led with a facilitator through some of these item analysis reports for purposes of identifying areas in need of perhaps greater attention in that manner. Booklets can be obtained from Riverside Insights for that purpose, and I would direct people in the webinar to Vicki Thomas, for example, or you, Allison, on how best to do that.
And I'd like to throw a word of caution in with this one too. When Steve was just talking about, reviewing the items, you don't want to go through all 50 items on the math assessment. You want to identify the ones that are outliers, you know, the ones where students they all answered the same incorrect answer, or they are performing way below the national average, or the ones where they're doing well. You know, that's also really important to identify areas where you are doing things that are reflecting positive performance. I think too often we spend looking at the negatives and we miss those positives, and they're valuable.
And I'd add one more, I wouldn't call it a word of caution, but just an understanding of how these assessments are developed. Any given question on the Iowa assessments is an exemplar of other kinds of questions in that same skill domain. So when teachers are looking at a particular question, as we focused on in this example, I think they should be asking themselves, okay, what other stuff is in that domain that is important in my instructional practices? Not just to focus on the individual item, but to recognize that there's a broader domain that item belongs to, and that domain is represented in the scope and sequence in the way I teach mathematics.
And so if you don't have access to the question, paying attention to the domain is just as important.
Thank you. So those were the questions for today. And as we are wrapping up, we want to again say thank you to Dr. Dunbar and Dr. Welch for joining us, and thank everyone for joining us today. Be sure to stay tuned for our next webinar next week. We are going to dig into the meaning of all those assessment scores that you see on these reports, like a standard score and a grade equivalent score, STAY9, what do all those mean, and look at what they tell us, how do we explain them to students and parents, what they mean instructionally in the classroom and from a district level and building level as well. So we're looking forward to that great discussion again. And we would love to hear your success stories in your buildings, how you're taking what you heard about today, maybe with all of these different reports, and how you're applying that in the classroom and moving student learning forward. So tell us what you are doing, and keep in touch with us. Any closing remarks?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone who joined today, and we hope to see you again for another webinar. And until next time, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.